Thank you, Mr. Owen. Mr. Curtis.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Matt Curtis. I'm the Government Relations Director for HomeAway. I actually come from local government myself. I was the aide to the last two mayors of Austin, Texas, and my background really is studying best practices on the municipal level, what works and what doesn't, where the model examples from around the world in a variety of industries. In the vacation rental space, I also serve on the Vacation Rental Managers Association, which is the oldest and the largest international association of vacation rental managers around the world. HomeAway is in an interesting spot. We're in our 11th year. So when I first got this call, they were talking about the new sharing economy and the new disruptive technologies, and I had to stop and say, you know, this is kind of fascinating for us because we've been around for a little while. Our oldest label, we're an acquisitive company, our oldest label is 40 years old, and our oldest listing in California is more than 40 years old. So we have somebody who's been listing and operating a vacation rental in California for more than 40 years. So we have been around for a little while, and traditionally we're an advertising platform. If you want to think of it like that, what we do is we advertise. We're a subscription-based model. You pay for an advertisement on our listing, and we connect the traveler with the owner or manager of that property. We almost exclusively work with owners or the managers that represent the owners. And that's, you know, has provided us a really great opportunity to really work with the people who actually have the true skin in the game, the people whose property this actually is that's being rented. Our typical involvement with governments around the country and around the world is we actually organize our owners and managers into local alliances and then teach them the best practices, the model examples, and what works and doesn't work about how to interact with local government. We find that to be the best approach, really let the people who are the owners and managers and have the skin in the game to have that involvement with government. When we talk about the best practices, the model examples, the ordinances that work and don't work, you know, providing a fair, Mr. Tingen mentioned the fair and uniform regulations, what we try to look back at is achieving something that addresses the demand of the traveler. There's different demands of travelers that are traveling in different ways. And you all have probably at one point or another tried a vacation rental. And you might have even searched on our site. Vacation rentals do achieve a certain demand that a traveler is expecting. They are expecting that residence to be their home while they're there. But we also want to make sure that we're achieving the highest rate of compliance. And to quote the U.S. Conference of Mayors, they said, onerous regulations drive short-term rental industry underground, thus evading local regulations and local taxes. And that fair regulations of short-term rentals ensures the highest rate of compliance and the greater receipt of hotel occupancy tax. I think the best examples of this can be found down in the Coachella Valley and Palm Desert, Palm Springs, Rancho Mirage, Indio, Cathedral City, where they have regulations that have been followed and have a high rate of compliance. And my favorite example is Austin, Texas, where a recent audit showed we have 72% compliance rate for people following the local rules and regulations there. So, you know, what we find is that the best way to achieve, I think, what we're all hoping for, a high rate of compliance and a high rate of people paying their hotel occupancy tax or transient occupancy tax, is to look at those best practices, look at those different model examples, and I think what they'll show you is the lower rates of barriers to people getting involved achieve the higher rate of compliance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Mr. Caldwell.
Chairman Manshine, Chairman Ting, thank you for inviting us. Obviously, a lot of people think they know what the hospitality industry thinks of Airbnb or VRBO and other platforms. The talking points from the other side amount to that the hospitality industry just doesn't like the competition. But the fact is the hospitality industry is probably the most competitive industry in the country. Right across the street from the Capitol, there's 4 hotels all within a block of each other. Our members compete against each other, not afraid of competition. All they insist on is fair competition. Regardless of who the competitor is, it's only right that everyone who participates in this business follows the same rules, pays their fair share. What the hospitality industry objects to is that some of the new competitors aren't playing fair. In fact, they make a point of arguing that they shouldn't, as if being part of a sharing economy gives them an exemption from the rules. But those rules are there for a good reason. For consumer safety, to supporting the communities where the businesses operate, services from which they benefit. Hotels in this state, for instance, spend a lot of money and effort on compliance with health and safety laws. I'll give you just one example. In the early 80s, there was a tragic fire in a hotel in Las Vegas, resulted in the loss of life. This legislature responded with an amendment to the Health and Safety Code, Health and Safety Code 13223, that among other things requires hotels to provide extensive information to guests on what to do in case of a fire. The signs you see, everything. Yes, compliance is costly, but this is important consumer protection, and a violation of these rules could result in jail time. That's how serious the members of the legislature felt. Jail time for not putting up those signs. Now, every hotel, motel, bed and breakfast in California must obey this law. But the kind of short-term residential units offered by the platforms do not. And that's only one example. We have a lot of other ones. But perhaps the best example is the lack of fairness is that the short-term rentals evade payment on TOT, the subject of this hearing, often by operating in direct violation of local ordinances. In Healdsburg, for example, the short-term rental of residential units is prohibited by city ordinance. But the hosting platforms are still arranging stays in those units in Healdsburg. Not surprisingly, they don't pay the 14% TOT that everyone else, including the licensed bed and breakfasts in town, now pay. That tax, as we've heard, pays for city services that benefit everyone in Healdsburg. But the residential short-term rentals simply ignore that part of the law as well. We believe that's inherently unfair, not only to hospitality competitors, but to the entire community. And this same behavior is happening in communities up and down California. Supporters of Airbnb and VRBO actually defend their unfairness. And one bill that's been introduced this year proposes to outlaw TOT, but only on residential.
And Mr. Caldwell, just for clarification, I just don't. This is informational, so I really don't want to get into discussing current legislation that perhaps is pending.
But the argument that's being made by other people is that this is just the little guy. It's just there's language like innovation is making it possible for ordinary people to earn additional income through apartment sharing arrangements like those offered by Airbnb, HomeAway, and VRBO. Well, in other words, we've got to protect the little guy renting out his bedroom from having to levy the same taxes as the big hotels. But according to Lane, the Los Angeles area new economy study on Airbnb, only 11% of Airbnb's revenue in Los Angeles comes from what the study classified as on-site host. In other words, the little guy. And the Lane study is not alone in making this observation. The Attorney General of New York subpoenaed Airbnb's records for the city of New York. What they found was a huge part of Airbnb's business was what the New York AG called commercial users. For example, they found a dozen hosts who rented not one or two rooms in their homes, but over 800 unique units with 14,000 reservations, 110,000 nights booked, and over $24 million in revenue. There were some commercial users with over 200 units, and every one of these dozen commercial users had more rooms to offer than most hotels in New York, not to mention bed and breakfast inns. So if a guy's renting out 200 rooms, that's a hotel by any other name. And yet we are told that it would result in unfair to charge TOT on the customers of those short-term residential rentals. There are, as we said, some other legislation out there, there's other ideas out there, but in the end, CHLA members stand for fairness. Our members comply with local ordinances, they pay taxes, and think it's only fair that every competitor comply with the same requirements.
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Questions or comments from the panel? Mr. Chu?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, let me just start by agreeing with Mr. Caldwell's perspective. It has been my perspective and certainly our city's perspective that everyone needs to be paying their fair share, whether they are a host on one of these platforms or whether they are a large hotel. And as I said earlier, in our city, we now have our law that requires all of our platforms to collect and remit taxes, and I want to thank Flipkey, TripAdvisor, as well as Airbnb for complying with that. And in fact, Airbnb, again, as I said before, has recently handed over tens of millions of dollars to San Francisco. I had a question for Mr. Curtis from HomeAway. Your platform has taken a very public perspective that you shouldn't have to pay these taxes. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to explain why you believe that should not be the case.
Well, as opposed to the other models, we're not the merchant of record, so we actually never hold the money. So the challenge for us would be, and thank you for asking that, the challenge for us would be how can you remit taxes when you actually never have any interaction with the finances that are being transacted between the traveler and the owner of the property. So in our situation, we are an advertising platform, a subscription-based model advertising platform, and are not the merchant of record.
So just to follow up on that, so I was looking on your site, and you have a payment processor, Yapstone, which can confirm whether booking reservations have occurred. So you're transferring that information somehow to Yapstone, and then you have another partner, HomeAway Payments, which is a way to secure those reservations. It's a way to make sure that people can pay online. There are processing fees that are attached to that, and I understand from your SEC filings that your pay-per-booking model accounts for 30% of your revenue model. So I'm wondering if you could, I mean, it seems to cut against exactly what you just said.
I don't actually. I don't know that it does. The merchant of record model. The company that you had spoken about is Yapstone, so I have a separate company from ours. The understanding that I have from the judicial proceeding that occurred in San Francisco was they did agree that we are not the merchant of record, so we are not to be. I guess viewed upon as a merchant of record in this circumstance. My understanding of how this process works with our company is we are simply connecting the owner and the manager to the traveler, and we provide them with a variety of tools to connect and possibly have that transaction take place and that rent take place. But we don't always know if the rent ever even actually happens.
So if I could just make two comments first to colleagues. So HomeAway sued San Francisco over our ability to move forward with this law. That suit was thrown out by the courts almost immediately. In fact, we assumed that everything that HomeAway said in their statements were true, and the court rejected it at that point. But I do want to follow up on your statement. Your company makes an awful lot of money from these pay-per-booking models. Isn't that correct?
I'm not aware of our funding from paper booking, so I couldn't speak to that.
So let me just read from your 10K and 10Q filings with the SEC. It seems like 30% of your HomeAway revenues are from these paper booking models. Is that something you're not aware of?
I'm not aware of that at all.
Okay. Well, I'll just let folks know what is in their filings, and also what is on your website is that you say that you collect processing fees, and this is a way for travelers and others to save money and time. I just want to point out there are actors who I think have worked with at least San Francisco to help us with the costs that our city has had to deal with travelers that come in to use this, and yet obviously we know, as Mr. Caldwell has pointed out, that there are at least some actors, including HomeAway, that have not chosen to do that. I do hope we'll be able to have more of a conversation about this as we move forward, but again, thank you for your testimony.
Any other questions or comments from the committee? I have just a couple to HomeAway and to Airbnb. What steps are you currently taking in California to work with local governments?
Thanks. Again, it's Matt Curtis with HomeAway. We pride ourselves on working very closely with local governments. In fact, like I said, I actually come from local government myself. We've been a longtime member of the National League of Cities and the United States Conference of Mayors, and we work very closely with local government think tanks, Harvard Urban Policy Advisory Board, and different groups like that. What we find is the best way to achieve the highest rate of compliance is to create a regulation that is very fair and easy for the traveler, or for the owners or the managers of the properties to be able to follow. So when we see the best practices and the model examples from different cities, we actually are able to find that those best practices do achieve high rates of compliance. Where we've worked very closely is typically through our owners and managers by helping them form local alliances, where we did in the Coachella Valley in Los Angeles as well, in Monterey County. But in Monterey County, they're still discussing regulations there. In Los Angeles, they're doing the same. But again, looking at those examples in the Coachella Valley, Palm Desert, Palm Springs, Rancho Mirage, Indio, Cathedral City, we actually have high rates of compliance, high rates of tax remittance, and very, achieving the demand of the traveler who is looking for that type of accommodation to stay. Truly, we pride ourselves on these interactions. We work very hard when we are able to work very effectively and get return phone calls from local government elected officials and people who we should be trying to have a very fair and balanced interaction with them, and actually be able to develop a good, fair relationship with folks like that. And then we achieve this high rate of compliance by helping to develop a policy that's fair and effective and achieves what the United States Conference of Mayors said, where I mentioned earlier, they said onerous regulations just drive the interaction underground.
And same question to Airbnb.
Sure. I think first on the tax question, as folks know, we have begun collecting and remitting transient occupancy taxes on behalf of our hosts and guests in San Francisco and San Jose. In San Jose, much like all of the other cities where we do this, including Portland, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Amsterdam, and I may be forgetting one or two, and there are surely more to come soon. We have voluntary collection agreements with the cities that recognize that while this is not our obligation from a legal perspective as a company, it's something which we know is important to our users, we know is a priority for local government, and we are happy in those circumstances to step in and enter into a contractual arrangement with the city whereby we do collect and remit on their behalf. We're also very interested in providing information to our users. Our platform is a tool for our hosts and for our guests. And for our hosts, we increasingly have city-specific information for a number of cities, certainly not all of them. There are many cities. But that resource is growing by the week, where hosts can access information about everything from local zoning ordinances, where they are clear, and in some places there certainly are not, to other local rules. If there are permitting requirements or other rules that are in place, we want to make sure that we provide that information to our users and are a resource there. And we are talking to local government in a number of places. Certainly we're not talking to everybody because there are many local governments, but we're increasing the number regularly that we are in communication with, and certainly working on crafting fair, simple rules that people can understand, that make sense, that embrace this new activity, this new economic activity, and this peer-to-peer economy while protecting things that cities really care about.
Okay, thank you. There's a section on your website, also on HomeAways as well, that discusses the responsibility of the host and says hosts should understand how the laws work in their cities, should understand zoning or administrative codes, registration or permit processes, or even obtaining a license before listing a property or accepting guests. Do you provide any sorts of resources or guidance for hosts other than kind of this language on a website, on your website? I mean, a number of us who in particular probably come from local government, I think have an appreciation of how complex local laws are, zoning, permits, tax collection, obtaining a license. All those are pretty complex, I think, even for people who are full-time in local government on city councils or county boards of supervisors, but particularly for a layperson, to understand what sort of resources or guidance do you provide?
Sure. So from our perspective, again, we are increasing the amount of city-specific information that we provide. For instance, whether it's San Francisco or West Hollywood or Malibu, we do provide specific links. We don't actually reprint the information from the city on our website. We summarize and we provide links because generally the city's links are more accurate than we could keep ours on our site in terms of the information and laws or rules or regulations or interpretations that may be shifting in literally thousands of cities around the world, 33,000 in our context. So we do provide that information. All of our users sign our check a box and agree to our terms of service, and it's important for us to bring their attention to the fact that there are rules and there are obligations that may apply, and that they should avail themselves of that information, and where we can, we provide that information to them or links to other resources where they can find it, and we're constantly reinforcing and increasing those resources. More than the vast majority of hosts on our platform, certainly more than 80% are folks who are sharing their primary residence, they're sharing their home, and in some cases, the law is confusing to folks, and so we do our best job to point them in the right direction, and we certainly are actively involved in speaking with local government officials, certainly around the state and around the country, to help clarify and urge them to embrace this new activity and this new economy.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments? And Mr. Chow, and I want to thank Mr. Chow for being here. He's here today in his role as chair of the Housing Committee. So thank you, Mr. Chow, and I understand you have a few questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Mr. Owen. According to a recent survey or a report, it indicates that almost close to 90% of Airbnb's revenues in Los Angeles were actually generated by the rental of whole units as opposed to share units. Question that I have for you is, how are these whole unit rentals consistent with the concept of home sharing, particularly in situations where these units are occupied by short-term renters for most of the year?
Sure. Thank you. And I can't speak to the specifics of that report. We were not consulted, so I certainly don't believe that the underlying data used is necessarily accurate for that purpose. But just because somebody has listed an entire space on our platform does not mean that it's not inhabited by a primary resident. A significant portion of our users travel away and invite guests into their home while they're not physically present. So while it is still their home, they're simply not present at the time of the rental. And that is a significant portion of the activity in a lot of cities on our platform, similar to websites that existed long before we did, like couch surfing, that enabled people to home swap. And that's a concept which has been around in Europe for a very long time. And to no surprise, we have very large and vibrant communities in European cities for that reason, and something which I think is now taking hold here in this country and in cities around the world. As to one point, I did want to address the question relative to a similar study that was cited by my colleague here on the dais, relative to New York and the taxation issue. We have repeatedly approached the City of New York about working on a voluntary collection agreement with them, and to this date they have expressed no interest in doing so with us, and we would encourage them and love for that to be the case.